Welcome back, listeners. We're diving deep into ADUs today. We've got a ton of research and articles to go through.
Yeah, looks like you've been busy. ADUs are definitely having a moment right now.
Yeah, and for good reason, I think. They're more than just like a fad. They're a real potential solution to a lot of the housing problems we're seeing.
Absolutely. It's like a hidden gem in your real estate toolkit. Tackling affordability, boosting property value, generating income. I mean, some studies even say you can boost your property value by like 25%.
Wow, 25%? That's a lot. So we're talking like backyard cottages, basement apartments, maybe even like a cool converted garage.
Exactly. All different flavors of ADUs, each with their own benefits.
Okay, so many possibilities. So where do we even begin with all this?
Well, first we got to understand like why they're gaining so much traction now. It's not just about extra space, right? It's about these creative solutions for how we live today.
So kind of like a release valve for the housing crunch.
Exactly. More homes without needing those huge new developments that take up a ton of land. They're a really smart way to add density to existing neighborhoods, which is great for sustainability.
Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal here. Can you give me a sense of the financial benefits? I'm thinking rental income, offsetting mortgage costs, maybe even early retirement.
You're thinking along the right lines. Imagine this. You're offsetting a big chunk of your mortgage, or you've got this extra income stream to fund those travel plans. Plus, studies show ADUs can increase property value. It's like your home becomes this hot commodity.
Sounds like a win-win, but there's got to be a catch, right? Building an ADU can't be that easy, especially with all the regulations you hear about.
You're right to be cautious. ADUs definitely come with regulations and things to consider. Understanding zoning, permitting, design guidelines, those are all key steps.
Okay, now I'm getting nervous. So before I drown in a sea of permits and regulations, can we break those down a bit? Where do I even start?
Your journey starts with research. It's like planning a big adventure. Before you set off, you'd study maps and gather supplies. Similarly, understanding those local ADU regulations, that's your first step.
Okay, research is key. But what kind of research are we talking about exactly?
Well, you need to really dig into those local zoning laws. Think of them as like the rule book for your neighborhood, telling you where you can build, what size limits you have, even design elements you need to maintain the neighborhood's look.
So it's not just about sketching out my dream ADU on a napkin and calling up a contractor.
Unfortunately not. You'll need detailed plans, you got to navigate that permitting process, and get approvals before you can even think about building. It's like getting your building passport, making sure your ADU is up to code and safe.
Okay, I'm definitely seeing the value of having an experienced guide for this journey. But even if I understand all the regulations, there's still the financing part. How do we pay for all of this?
That's where it gets exciting. There are so many options. Home equity loans, construction loans, even some government incentives to encourage ADU development.
Okay, so we've got a handle on the benefits, the potential challenges, and the first big step, research. Once I've done my homework, how do I actually get started building my dream ADU?
That's a great question. It's like putting a puzzle together. First, you got to know the rules. Then you can start piecing together your vision.
All right, let's break down those pieces. What are the crucial steps?
First, let's dive into the design phase. This is where your ADU dream takes shape.
Okay, I'm all ears. Okay, so we've got regulations, we're excited about the benefits, and we're starting to picture the possibilities. Now let's get into actually designing the ADU itself.
This is where it gets fun.
Yeah.
We can unleash our creativity, right? But we got to keep those zoning regulations in mind. Those are still our guiding principles.
Right, so how do we balance creativity with those regulatory limits? How do we get a functional ADU that still looks amazing?
That's where a good architect or designer comes in, someone who really specializes in ADUs. They're like master puzzle solvers,
Yeah.
They can navigate all those complex regulations and create a design that works for you within the rules.
Sounds like they're worth their weight in gold. What are some of the key things they would consider during this design phase?
Well, they're going to look at your specific needs and how those influence the design. Are you building for like aging parents who need accessibility? Or maybe it's a rental unit for extra income. Or maybe it's just like your personal oasis, a home office, a studio, something like that. The design needs to reflect that.
Okay, so it's all about matching the design to our goals. But it's not just about our needs, right? The property itself matters too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you've got a stunning view, you don't want to block it with the ADU. The design team will look at your property, things like sunlight, privacy from neighbors, even views from the unit.
Makes sense. It's like they're painting a picture using the landscape as their canvas. But let's zoom in a little. What are some of the little details, the things that can make or break a good ADU design?
Well, first, think about the layout and flow. How will you actually use this space? How will people move through it? You know, a tiny house with the bedroom right next to the kitchen, that's not ideal. You want to make sure there's a logical flow, maximize privacy, minimize noise.
Okay, yeah, I'm starting to see the ADU come to life in my mind. But what about storage? That's always a challenge in smaller spaces.
Storage is super important, especially in ADUs where you're trying to be efficient with space. We're talking built-in shelves, understair storage, furniture that has multiple uses, all those clever tricks to stay organized.
It's like those space-saving hacks you see on TV, but applied to an entire ADU.
Exactly. And we can't forget about natural light. No one wants to live in a dark space. So think about windows, skylights, bringing in that natural light to make it feel bright and airy.
Now you're talking. I can already feel the sunshine streaming in. But what about ventilation? We don't want it to feel stuffy, especially when it gets warm.
Good point. You want to make sure there's good airflow, operable windows, vents, even ceiling fans. All those things will help keep the air fresh.
Okay, so we've got layout, storage, light, ventilation, all those important things. Now for the fun part, aesthetics. How do we bring our personal style into the ADU design?
Yes, this is where you get to pick out all the fun stuff. The flooring, cabinets, countertops, paint colors, all that. It's like curating your own little home, filled with things you love.
I love that. But we don't want the ADU to stick out like a sore thumb. How do we make sure it blends in with the main house and the neighborhood?
That's where your design team's expertise comes in again. They'll help you pick exterior finishes, siding, roofing, landscaping, all those things that make it feel like it belongs, complements the existing architecture.
It's all about creating that sense of harmony. Now, we talked about accessibility a bit before, but I want to come back to it because it's so important, especially for anyone building an ADU for aging parents or someone with mobility issues.
Absolutely. Accessibility should be a top priority. Think about a step-free entry, maybe a ramp, wider hallways and doorways, grab bars in the bathroom, all those features that make it easy to navigate and safe.
Those are all great points. Even if you're not building for someone with mobility issues now, it's a good idea to think ahead, future-proofing the ADU.
Exactly. It adds value and makes it adaptable for the future. Now, onto a topic that can be a bit scary: budget.
Okay, I'm bracing myself for the financial reality check.
It's true, building an ADU can be a big investment, but it doesn't have to break the bank. There are ways to manage costs and stay within your budget.
Okay, give me those money-saving tips. I'm all ears.
First, be realistic about what you need and what you can afford. You don't have to have every single bell and whistle. Prioritize the must-haves and be willing to compromise on the nice-to-haves.
So practical and functional over extravagant and over the top.
Exactly. And remember, you can save money on materials. Maybe instead of those fancy hardwood floors, you go with a more budget-friendly option like laminate or tile in areas that get a lot of foot traffic.
I bet there are similar options for countertops and cabinets too, right?
You got it. There are so many beautiful and durable alternatives to those pricey granite or marble countertops.
So it's all about being resourceful and finding different options without sacrificing style or quality. What other tricks do we have up our sleeve?
Here's a big one. Keep it compact. Smaller ADUs use less material and labor, so they cost less overall.
Think cozy and efficient, not sprawling and palatial.
You got it. And if you're feeling handy, you can even tackle some of the work yourself.
I do love a good DIY project.
Yeah.
But what are some realistic DIY tasks for an ADU? I'm not exactly a professional builder.
Things like painting, landscaping, maybe some basic finishing work. Those are all things that homeowners can often handle if they have the right skills and tools. It's a great way to save some money and add your own personal touch.
So a little sweat equity can go a long way. But let's be honest, the big question is, how much does it actually cost to build an ADU?
That's a million-dollar question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. It really depends on your location, the design, those site conditions we talked about.
So building an ADU in San Francisco is probably going to be a bit more expensive than, say, rural Kansas.
You got it. Location is huge. And of course, a larger, fancier ADU with all the bells and whistles is going to cost more than a smaller, more basic one. It's all about finding that balance between your vision and your budget.
Okay, I'm starting to see how complex it can be. So how do we even start to figure out those costs?
Online cost calculators can be a good place to start. They can give you a rough estimate based on your location, size, desired features. But for a more accurate number, you'll want to talk to local builders and contractors who have experience with ADUs.
So do your research, gather information, and get those real quotes from the pros. Now that we've talked about costs, let's move on to the next stage, getting those permits.
Ah, yes, the permitting process. It's not as scary as it sounds, but you got to be patient and pay attention to detail. Think of it like gathering the ingredients for your ADU recipe.
Okay, I'm ready to gather those ingredients. What do we need?
You'll need a full set of drawings, plans, calculations, proof of ownership, basically everything to show that your project meets all the codes and regulations.
Sounds like a lot of paperwork, but once we have it all, what's next?
Then you submit your application to the local building department. Think of it like presenting your masterpiece to the judges.
And I'm guessing there's a fee for this judging process.
Usually, yeah. The fees vary depending on how complex your project is and what the specific requirements are in your city or town.
So another cost to factor in. Once
Okay.
we submit the application, what happens? Do we just wait?
Not quite. The review process begins. Building officials will go over everything with a fine-tooth comb, making sure it's structurally sound, fire-safe, accessible, all those important things. They're making sure your ADU is safe and meets all the requirements.
So they're like meticulous inspectors, making sure everything's up to code. And I'm guessing this review takes some time.
It can, yeah, depending on how busy they are and how complex your project is.
So patience is key.
Absolutely. And be prepared for them to maybe ask for changes or more information. It's all part of the process.
So it's a back and forth until everything is perfect.
Exactly. Think of it as a collaboration to make sure your ADU is the best it can be.
Okay, so let's say our plans are approved. What happens then?
Congratulations. You'll get your building permit, your official green light to start construction.
Time to break ground. But wait, before we get ahead of ourselves, are there any other steps before we actually start building?
You're right to be cautious. Before you break ground, you've got to schedule inspections. These are like quality checks throughout the process, making sure everything is being built correctly and safely.
Okay, so these inspections are pretty important, though.
Well, yeah, they're essential. They'll come and check the foundation, framing, electrical, plumbing, you name it, making sure it's all up to code. And you have to pass each inspection before you can move on to the next stage.
So it's not just a bureaucratic hoop to jump through. It's actually about making sure the ADU is safe and built right.
Exactly. And then once the construction is all finished, there's a final inspection, the big one. They check everything, from the roof to the electrical outlets, to make sure it's ready for occupancy.
And if everything is good, we get the certificate of occupancy.
That's right. That means you're good to go. You can move in or rent it out.
So we've made it through the permitting process, construction is done, our ADU is ready for its big debut. What happens now? What about after all the excitement dies down?
That's when the real journey begins. Maintaining your ADU is just as important as building it correctly.
Okay, let's talk ADU maintenance. What do we need to think about?
It's like taking care of a new car. You want to keep it running smoothly, so regular checkups and maintenance are key. Clean those gutters, check the roof, service the appliances, all those little things that can prevent big problems down the road.
So be proactive and catch those potential issues early on.
Exactly. And don't forget about safety. Test your smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, fire extinguishers. Make sure everything is working properly.
Safety first. Now let's get down to business. We talked about the costs of building, but what about the financial benefits? Everyone wants to know about that rental income.
Let's crunch those numbers. One of the best things about ADUs is that you can potentially make some passive income by renting it out.
Give me the rundown. How does that work in real life?
Imagine this. You've got that detached ADU in your backyard. You rent it out, and boom, you've got a steady flow of passive income coming in every month. You can use it to help pay your mortgage, save for retirement, maybe take that dream vacation you've been wanting.
It's like having a little money tree growing in your backyard. What about attached ADUs? Can those be rented out too?
You can, but you've got to check those local regulations again. Some places might have rules about what kind of rentals are allowed for attached ADUs.
So maybe we're limited to long-term rentals for attached ADUs, while detached ADUs could be more flexible for short-term rentals.
That's possible. Do your research and make sure you're following the rules in your area.
Okay, so rental income is a major plus. But what about the big picture? How does having an ADU affect property value?
Adding an ADU can really boost your home's value. Think about it. You're selling your home with an extra income generating unit. That's a big selling point for buyers, especially in places where housing is in high demand.
So it's not just about the rental income now, it's also a smart investment for the future.
Exactly. It's a great way to build equity and potentially make a bigger profit when you sell down the line.
Now, I know we talked about property taxes before, but it's an important thing to remember. We don't want any surprises when those tax bills come around.
You're right to be thinking about that. Adding an ADU will probably increase your property taxes.
Mm.
But keep in mind, that increase is often offset by the financial benefits of the ADU, that rental income, and the boost in property value.
So it's all about looking at the big picture and weighing those pros and cons.
Exactly. And speaking of financial stuff, we can't forget about insurance.
Okay, insurance. Fill me in. What do we need to know about that?
You'll need to update your homeowner's insurance to include the ADU. Your current policy probably won't cover a separate living space on your property.
So we need to make sure it's insured, in case of any damage or liability issues.
Exactly. Talk to your insurance agent about adding coverage for the ADU to your policy.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's switch gears a bit. We've talked a lot about the money side of things, but there's more to it, right? What about the social and environmental impacts of ADUs?
ADUs get a lot of praise for their positive impact on communities and the environment. It's not just about the building itself, it's about creating a more sustainable and equitable future.
Okay, that sounds interesting. Tell me more.
Well, ADUs can be a game changer when it comes to affordable housing. By adding more housing units to existing neighborhoods, they help increase the supply of affordable options.
So it's like bringing in more players to the housing game, which helps even things out a bit.
Exactly. And because ADUs are usually built on existing land, it encourages something called infill development, which means we're using land more efficiently and reducing sprawl. That helps protect open spaces and keeps costs down for things like roads and utilities.
It's a win-win for both people and the environment. But how are ADUs specifically environmentally friendly?
Well, they're usually smaller than typical houses, so they use less energy for heating and cooling.
So they're more efficient, which is good for our wallets and good for the planet.
Exactly.
Mm.
And by not needing as much new development, ADUs also help prevent things like cutting down trees and destroying habitats. Plus, they often make it easier for people to use alternative modes of transportation.
Okay, I'm curious about that. How do ADUs encourage things like walking, biking, or public transportation?
Well, they're often in neighborhoods where those things are already available. So
Mhm.
people living in ADUs might not need to rely on cars as much, which means less traffic and fewer emissions.
So it's a more sustainable way of living overall.
Absolutely. It's about creating a better relationship between where we live and the natural world. Now, let's talk about something that often gets overlooked, the legal stuff.
Okay, I'm ready to tackle the legal side of things. What do we need to be aware of?
You've got to understand your rights and responsibilities as an ADU owner, both for your protection and if you're renting it out for the well-being of your tenants.
All right, break it down for me. Where do we start?
One of the most important things is the rental agreement. If you're going to rent out your ADU, you need a good, solid agreement that spells out all the details, like rent, security deposits, who's responsible for maintenance, all that. It protects both you and the tenant.
So it's like a roadmap for a successful landlord-tenant relationship. What other legal things should we be thinking about?
Well, there are specific laws about landlord-tenant relationships that cover everything from fair housing to evictions. Make sure you're familiar with those laws so you're doing things by the book.
It sounds like we need to have our legal ducks in a row. What about liability? As an ADU owner, what are we responsible for?
You're responsible for keeping the ADU safe and livable for your tenants. That means regular inspections, fixing any hazards, and making sure it meets all the safety codes.
Right, so those inspections and addressing any hazards are really important. What about noise? That can be a big issue, especially in close quarters.
You're right, noise can be tricky, especially if the ADU is attached or close to neighbors.
So how do we keep the noise down and everyone happy?
Well, when you're designing the ADU, you can include things to help with soundproofing, insulation, double-pane windows, solid doors, things like that.
So it's like building those noise barriers right into the structure itself.
Exactly. And think about the layout, too. Try to keep noisy areas like the kitchen or living room away from the bedrooms.
Okay, that makes sense. And I bet being upfront with your tenants about NARS expectations is important too.
Definitely. Setting those ground rules from the beginning can really help prevent problems down the road. Now, let's talk about something that can be a bit confusing. Property lines.
Okay, time to untangle those boundaries.
It's crucial to know exactly where your property ends and your neighbor's begins, especially when you're figuring out where to put the ADU. We don't want any accidental border crossings.
Right, we're talking about setbacks and easements, right?
Exactly. Those setbacks we talked about earlier, make sure the ADU is a safe distance from the property lines, to avoid any issues with encroaching on your neighbor's space.
And easements, what are those all about?
Easements are these legal agreements that give someone the right to use part of your property for a specific purpose, like utilities or shared driveway.
So we need to know about any easements that might affect where we can put the ADU.
Absolutely. Now, before we finish up, let's look ahead.
Oh, a peek into the future. I love it.
Yeah.
What do you see happening with ADUs down the road?
I think ADUs are here to stay. They're going to be more and more important in our communities in the future.
I can see why. They have so much to offer.
Exactly. And as more cities make it easier to build ADUs, we're going to see even more innovation, new designs, new ways to build them.
So we might see more prefabricated ADUs, modular designs, and even those cool new eco-friendly materials.
You got it. And I think we'll start seeing more ADUs used for things besides just rental income. Multi-generational living, home offices, art studios. The possibilities are endless.
It's about adapting to how we live and creating spaces that make our lives better.
Precisely. And technology is going to play a big role in ADUs too. Think about smart home features, energy monitoring, virtual assistants, all that cool stuff that makes our lives easier.
Sounds like the ADU of the future is already on its way. But before we get too carried away with all the future stuff, let's bring it back to our listeners who are ready to get started on their ADU journey. What's your best advice for them?
Dream big, but always do your research, plan carefully, and be open to all the exciting possibilities that ADUs offer.
That's great advice. And on that note of possibilities, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of ADUs. Thanks for joining us. We've covered a lot of ground, from regulations and design to the financial side of things, and even a glimpse into the future of ADUs. It's clear that ADUs are more than just a trend. They're a smart investment with the potential to really change how we live and interact with our communities.
And as we've seen, successful ADU projects require research, planning, and a willingness to think outside the box.
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, I want to touch on a few more things that can make or break an ADU project, things that maybe don't get talked about as much.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
What else should we be thinking about?
Well, I'm thinking about the day-to-day stuff. Managing the ADU, especially if you're renting it out. It's one thing to build it, but it's another thing to be a good landlord.
You're right. Managing an ADU, whether it's for family or renters, comes with its own set of responsibilities.
So for those listeners who are thinking about becoming ADU landlords, what are some tips for a smooth and successful rental experience?
First things first, remember those local rental regulations we talked about. Make sure you know those rules inside and out, whether it's rent control, security deposits, evictions, all that. You got to play by the rules.
So know the rules of the game before you start playing.
Exactly. And just like any good team, communication is key. Be clear about expectations from the get-go, address any concerns quickly, and keep those lines of communication open throughout the entire tenancy.
It sounds like being a good ADU landlord needs a mix of organization, communication skills, and maybe a little bit of empathy too.
You got it.
Yeah.
And don't forget about those practical things like maintenance. Imagine your tenant dealing with a leaky faucet or a broken appliance. Not a fun situation for anyone.
Oh yeah, that would be a nightmare. So what's the best way to handle those maintenance issues that are bound to come up?
Be proactive. Have a plan in place. Take care of any issues right away and keep those communication lines open with your tenants. A well-maintained ADU makes everyone happy.
Makes perfect sense. Now let's switch gears for a minute and talk about something that can be a real headache for homeowners and ADU residents alike. Parking.
Ah, yes, the parking puzzle. It's a valid concern, especially in areas where street parking is already hard to come by.
So how do we solve this parking problem? Where do we even start?
Well, first you got to remember those local regulations. Some places actually require dedicated off-street parking for ADUs to prevent parking wars from breaking out.
So check those rules before you get too far along in the design process. But what if off-street parking just isn't an option?
That's where you got to get creative. If you're working with a small space, think about compact, car-friendly parking, tandem parking, or maybe even things like car sharing or bike storage to reduce the need for multiple vehicles.
So think outside the box when it comes to parking.
Exactly. And if you're thinking about sustainability, promoting alternative transportation options can be a great solution, especially if the ADU is close to public transit.
It's a good way to reduce traffic and encourage a greener lifestyle. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on one of my favorite things about ADUs, how they can bring people together and make communities stronger.
I agree. ADUs aren't just about adding buildings, they're about building connections and creating neighborhoods that are more vibrant and inclusive.
Exactly. And as we've seen, ADUs can be such a creative solution to so many of the challenges we face today.
They can help make housing more affordable, provide options for extended families, and even generate income to help with finances. It's about finding the right solution for your needs.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I encourage everyone listening to keep exploring those possibilities. Do your research, imagine your dream ADU, and embrace the potential of these incredible spaces.
Knowledge is power, and with a little planning and creativity, you can turn your ADU dream into reality.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you feel informed and ready to embark on your own ADU adventure.